Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining the Rutgers Geology Museum's Ask a Geologist web series. Today we have Dr. Sarah Sheffield, and she will be speaking to us about Echinoderm Paleontology, and she's an assistant professor at the University of South Florida. So without further delay, Sarah, go ahead.
Thank you so much. I am so excited to be here today, and thank you so much for having me. I'm kind of jealous of your weather right now because it's still like 95 degrees down here in Tampa, but that's okay. Might go away by December. So I'll be talking to you today, as the introduction, of course, said, about Echinoderm Paleontology. So I wanted to show you a little bit about my very favorite fossil in the entire world, which is this cute little critter right here. And I know what you're thinking. That is too precious to have ever lived, right? Exactly. So this is actually an echinoderm, just like our friend, the modern day starfish. And I'll talk to you a little bit about how we know the relationships between the things we know and love, like starfish, and critters like this that lived hundreds of millions of years ago. But this little critter here, its name is Eumorpha Cystis. It lived in the Ordovician, so just over about 450 million years ago in Oklahoma, when Oklahoma was a lovely tropical sea. At one point it was. All right. So, as the introduction said, of course, I'm a paleontologist and I'm a assistant professor at the University of South Florida in Tampa. I have been here for about 3 years and I really love it. The students are great. And I'll talk to you a little bit about what I do with the students a little bit later. My expertise is in invertebrate paleontology, which means I study things without backbones. Primarily, I work with echinoderms, though I also look at trilobites and brachiopods and other big fossil groups. Now, because I'm a paleontologist, obviously I have a favorite dinosaur, right? Dinosaurs always have a special place in my heart, even if I don't study them. And this one here, Parasaurolophus, the big duckbill one with the horn on the back of its head, that is my favorite. And the reason it's my favorite is because it could actually use that horn probably to make calls, right? So it can make sounds from it, we think. And I just really like thinking about all the things it would have been saying to its friends with its horn. We'll never know, but it's always my favorite thing to think about. So echinoderm evolution. This is a starfish fossil called Astropecten, all right? And it's beautiful. It's gorgeous, right? Now, when we think of fossils, fossils are actually really difficult to preserve. Out of everything that's ever lived, the chance that something will become a fossil is almost zero. So the fact that we ever have fossils is really something to celebrate. But when we take a look at this starfish, it is incredibly well preserved, and that in itself is a feat. There are over 1 million pieces to the starfish you're looking at right there. 1 million separate pieces, as opposed to the 206 bones that humans have. So the fact that we can even get these kinds of fossils is absolutely beautiful. But it's pretty rare that we find fossils this well preserved, and that can make it really difficult for us to see how echinoderms have evolved through time and who they're related to, because we're often working with poorly preserved fossils or very few fossils. So I'll talk to you a little bit about how we get past those hurdles and how we start to make these interpretations. So my first research question is evolutionary relationships. So who is related to whom? Who is the starfish most closely related to? Who are the sea biscuits most closely related to? Those are the types of questions we'll be asking. How do echinoderms change through time? So echinoderms are super cool in that they evolved all kinds of absolutely wild features, like giant arms and giant mouths, and then tiny mouths and tiny arms, really quickly evolutionary time. But we don't really know why. That's another good question, and it's not like the starfish are going to talk to us. They're not going to be like, those big arms, they were a mistake, but here's why we did it. So we go back into the fossil record to find out more about why they did this. So here are our modern echinoderm friends. So first, of course, we have our sea star, we have our brittle stars, we have our crinoids, sea urchins, and sea cucumbers. These are the big 5 groups. And one of the things that we know about echinoderms today is that they're pretty sensitive to climate change and warming oceans. Well, if they're sensitive today to climate change and warming oceans, does that mean echinoderms in the past would have been sensitive the same way? Probably, but we really don't know for sure. But what we can do potentially is use what we know about modern echinoderms and apply them to the past record. But one of the things that makes this a little more difficult is echinoderms used to be much, much more diverse than this. Much more. So I'll show you a tree of what that looks like here in just a second. But on the right, you see a geologic timescale. This is kind of a fun artsy interpretation of it. We are here at the pickup truck, okay? We are living in the Holocene. We have the Cenozoic that extends back 65 million years ago, separated by the asteroid impact that killed off a lot of the dinosaurs. All right, we have the Mesozoic, and then we have the Paleozoic, which is where all of my critters lived, about 450 million years ago, in a time called the Ordovician, and some in the Cambrian. So these are what our echinoderms looked like back then. And I know what you're thinking. There's no way this soft serve ice cream thing actually is an echinoderm. That's not a starfish. It actually is closely related, and it has a lot of other features that it shares with it. But if you take a look at some of these, perhaps this here, this is called an Idrio Asteroid. It looks like it has that starfish shape, right? That little 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's kind of like a cookie with a starfish on top, and it would have lived on something like a rock or another living thing, and it kind of just sticks itself to it and then freeloads for the rest of its life, right? Had a pretty good life. So these are the types of echinoderms that lived hundreds of millions of years ago. And one of the really cool things about them is you can take a look at this and just say, wow, they are so different from each other. They absolutely are. That's not just you thinking that. Scientists don't understand why they're so different either. So one of the things that we do is we try to understand how these different creatures are related so that we can start to figure out other types of questions. For example, if I want to know how they've changed through time, I have to know who's related to who so I can start testing these hypotheses. So let's take a look at what we think that hypothesis would look like. This is called a phylogenetic tree, or more simply, an evolutionary tree. Now, this might look a little confusing at first if you're not used to reading these, but they're kind of just like a family tree. The branches, like right here, that are closest together indicate very close relationships. The ones that are far away from each other indicate that they're not so closely related. So these are all of the echinoderm groups. The ones that are still living today are in orange. For some reason, the crinoid picture didn't come up here. Sorry about that. And we have the extinct or dead organisms in white here. And what we see is that there is so much diversity of echinoderms that we would never have known without looking back into the fossil record. So this is just one hypothesis of how they were closely related. We think most of our modern critters are pretty closely related over here, with one exception over here with the crinoids. And what we can see while we're looking at this is that we see certain features that evolve a bunch of different times. So for example, if you look here, this is called a blastoid. And if you look here, this is a parablastoid. Their names sound similar, but they're not closely related. But do you see how they both have like this flypaper looking thing hanging down? That's their food grooves. And they're not closely related. We actually just see similarities showing up in different parts of the tree. This is similar to the concept of wings. Birds have wings, right? Bats have wings, insects have wings, and pterodactyls have wings. But insects and pterodactyls aren't really closely related, right? Not even a little bit. And we know that bats and birds are two different groups. Mammals and birds come from reptiles. So things re-evolve through time. And that gives us really cool information about why things might be changing. So why might these little flypaper looking food grooves help? Why might they be showing up more than once? Were they helpful? We don't know. So let's start to answer some of these questions here. So first, how was this diagram made? This is actually, it looks like a very simple diagram here, right? It's just a bunch of little lines, but this took an impressive amount of computer work, It actually broke my graduate school laptop, so it never came back from this. So how we do this is I'll show you. We take fossil finds from places in the field and museum collections, and we analyze all of the features on its body for each separate species. We then put it into a large database, and then we run computer programs to try and match up the evolutionary relationships. So it's kind of like one of those puzzles that you might see on somebody's desk where you can rearrange all the pieces and then one doesn't fit, so you've got to start all over. It's kind of like that. So the computer will run literally billions to trillions of different solutions to find out who's most closely related. And one of the ways that the computer will pick this is it will say, I want the fewest number of changes from the ancestor to the descendant. So it keeps rearranging and rearranging until it finds a better solution, which is why it's so difficult to build these trees. So here is an example of why this is so important, that we go out both into the fossil or out into the field to find new fossils and into the museum. So here on the left is my colleagues and I working in Sardinia, which is the island kind of, if here's Italy right here, there's the toe of the boot, Sardinia is kind of right over there. So it's beautiful, right? Right on the other side of this mountain or the Mediterranean. It's gorgeous, absolutely beautiful. But what was even more beautiful were the echinoderm fossils that we found there. No one had gone looking for echinoderm fossils there before. So within 1 week of fieldwork, we found 10 new species of echinoderms that had never been documented before. So then when we put that into our database, it completely changes what we thought we knew about those evolutionary relationships. Now on the right, that is a photo of me looking at fossils in the Czech Republic at the National Museum of Natural History. And a lot of these fossils were collected in the 1820s and 1830s, and no one had looked at them since. So even though we knew they were there, no one had really looked at them. So we get to put all of this together into a large database to figure out how these echinoderms might be related to one another. And that is how we end up with this beautiful little tree here. So now that we have a tree, and again, here's my favorite fossil, Eumorpha Cystis. I just thought we should look at it one more time. We can start to test different hypotheses. We can run different science experiments, like how many times certain features evolved. As the example we used previously, wings evolved over 4 times in evolutionary history in animals, right? So one thing that echinoderms do is they re-evolve, like wings re-evolve. They re-evolve respiratory structures, like your lungs, right? That's a respiratory structure. So here on this fossil, the respiratory structures are these little holes all over the body. That's how it's breathing. So those little holes allow seawater to come in and gas exchange happens. So oxygen to carbon dioxide. It's an animal, so it's breathing in oxygen just like you and me, breathing out carbon dioxide. So these respiratory structures, these little holes, actually re-evolve in echinoderms over and over again. So maybe there's a reason, like they were really helpful in shallow water, or maybe they were really helpful in warm water. We don't know yet. We're still testing that hypothesis. We can also figure out how echinoderms moved across oceans in the past. So if you can imagine with me, a starfish, they actually start out their life as a larva, a little itty bitty little squirmy swimming thing, right? And even this thing here with a stem that lived planted in the ocean essentially as an animal, it started out as a larva too that could swim a little bit. So if we know how they're related, we can actually start to pinpoint how they traveled across the ocean. And they're doing this as little itty bitty swimming larvae across giant ocean basins over hundreds of millions of years. And it can tell us the story of how this particular echinoderm, Eumorpha Cystis, actually got to North America in the first place, because this group originated in the middle of the Czech Republic, we think. So how did it cross that giant ocean? Now remember, land wasn't in the same place as it is now. We have plate tectonics, which means things have moved. But what was North America and what was the Czech Republic were still separated by quite a bit of distance. And it can also tell us how they responded to warm and cold times on Earth. So climate change is something that's always happening. The Earth's climate is always changing. We're worried about it now because the speed at which it's changing is much, much faster than anything we've seen in the previous times, but we have seen warmer and colder times on Earth. So one thing we can do is we can use how fossil echinoderms responded to these really warm times. And if I know that, could I make a prediction about what modern echinoderms might do when oceans are warming, which they're doing right now? So let's take a look at what that might look like. Here we have the world 480 million years ago. This is what it looked like. To orient yourself, New Jersey's right about here where my cursor is. Florida is a mere twinkle in North America's eye. It will not be here for another 350-ish million years. Florida is the baby of the United States, geologically speaking. So 470, 460 to 450 million years ago. These dots tell us how many echinoderm fossils we have, okay? So this is a really good example because a lot of people from New York and New Jersey come to Florida, right? Every winter, the snowbirds. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept, but in Tampa, every fall and winter, we have lots of people from New Jersey and New York come down because it's still really warm here. And then when it gets summer here, everybody goes right back up north to avoid the horrible heat that is the Tampa summer. Echinoderms are like the old snowbirds of the Paleozoic. So when it gets really, really, really warm, which it did 470 million years ago, they pack up their bags, metaphorically speaking, not literally speaking, and they move down to the South Pole. And they crowd down here because it's tolerable. It's not nearly as boiling as it was on the equator, where it's a lot warmer. But then, a little bit later, closer to 450 million years, the temperatures actually started dropping again. It started getting really cold. So echinoderms start moving back up to the equator to stay warmer. So we can actually see how climate change affected echinoderms. It actually affected where they lived. They were moving to try and stay away from this cold weather and this warm weather, essentially. So what we can start to do is we can start to piece together how echinoderms might start changing with relation to climate change today. So here's a map of how they would have been moving. Again, here is North America. All right, lots of it's underwater, which is why it looks a lot smaller. Here we have the Iapetus Ocean. That's the ancient ocean basins. It doesn't exist anymore. All right, and here is Gondwana. Gondwana is what makes up Africa, South America, Australia. So it's a really big supercontinent from the past. Once Gondwana broke up, we have those separate pieces right there. And we have Baltica in the middle, which is where Norway, Sweden, Finland is now. So what we can see is echinoderms are actually moving in their larval stage all the way from North America all the way over to Africa and South America and, Australia and Gondwana. They were crossing the ocean basins here. We see that some moved from Gondwana over to Baltica, again, where like Norway and Sweden is now today. Now, this looks really different from a map that we would see of the world today. Remember, plate tectonics has changed this. So most of our land masses, most of our continents were actually kind of closer to the equator during this time. Gondwana was situated closer to the poles than North America was. And Norway and Sweden was essentially a tropical paradise. Not so much the same today. So again, this can tell us a lot about what features echinoderms might have found helpful, right? Which might have promoted their survival rates throughout a time of climate change. It can tell us what environments might have been better suited for echinoderms. It can kind of give us a roadmap of how echinoderms might fare in the future, in the next 100 years, in the next couple hundred years, with warming oceans today. So what else do I do? Research is not the only thing that I do at the University of South Florida. I love teaching. It is my favorite part of the job. I teach classes in general geology, sedimentology, so sedimentary rocks like sandstone and carbonate rocks like limestone. Florida is just one giant limestone block. It is awesome. I also work for a science blog called Time Scavengers. If you are here because you love science and geology, I hope you check out Time Scavengers. It's a blog all about paleontology and climate change, written by a whole bunch of scientists like myself. I also do a whole lot of events where I go talk to school kids and other interested people about paleontology and how cool it is. So here I am losing my dignity in front of a group of fourth graders by pretending to be a dinosaur. There you go. So, and I work with graduate students and undergraduate students, so training the next generation of scientists. So I'll show you a little bit about how I go about working for Time Scavengers and working as an educator. So one of the things we do is my science classes, we go out into the field a lot and we take field trips. So here we are at Blowing Rocks. It's a preserve on the eastern coast of Florida. I'm on the western coast of Florida, where the carbonate, the limestone rocks. Now, limestone has a really cool party trick. You can take a little bit of hydrochloric acid and you can drop it on the rock and it'll fizz a little. The rock is actually dissolving just a tiny bit. So the ocean water is a little bit acidic and rainwater is acidic. So the water over time will actually break down these rocks, which is why there's so many jagged pieces to them. So at high tide, the water can explode through these holes in the rocks. It's really fun to watch. So one of the things that I do with my students and with my work on the Time Scavengers blog is I write up these posts with pictures and videos. So people who maybe don't live close enough to blowing rocks to visit, or maybe you want to find new places to travel to once the pandemic is over, you can read these and find out more about the amazing places in the United States. Or I do a lot of field work and I do a lot of geology related travel. So for example, here I am in Spain looking at an ancient ocean. There are crinoid fossils all over these rocks, which is why I think I spent like 2 hours just staring at them. Absolutely beautiful. Or here in the Bay of Fundy. This is where the tides are the highest in the world. The tide can actually go right on up to the base of these rocks. These are the Hopewell rocks, some very famous rocks. So for those people who want to learn more about geology, but may not have the ability to get out and travel, or may not know about all these cool places yet, they can read up these posts on Time Scavengers to learn a bit more. And one of my last things is, one of the cool things about this pandemic right now, one of the silver linings is we're doing more of these events where I can meet new people and you can meet new people and we can learn more about science. And we can start to share science in ways that we haven't been doing before. But one thing I want to show you is because a lot of the times when we look at geologists, we're like, wow, everything is just, you get to travel, you get to do these cool places. But what if you don't have the opportunity to travel too much? Does that mean you can't experience geology? No, it doesn't. So you can do things like check out local bathrooms. So here is a post I wrote on bathroom geology. So here is a bathroom counter that is a beautiful, beautiful granite with really cool plagioclase. It's a mineral showing different cooling temperatures right here. That's why it has little rims around it. Or here is the bathroom in the middle of St. Pete. That's a St. Pete beach. It's a famous beach not too far away from me. And the bathroom walls are made out of fossil materials. Or even here, this is just a random bathroom somewhere. I don't even remember where I was, but it has a beautiful metamorphic rock right here. Gorgeous, right? So even if you're somewhere you don't expect, even if you're somewhere you've been a whole bunch, maybe you can still find some cool geology. So geology is all around us, and I really like that. So hopefully you find some cool geology no matter wherever you are. And with that, I will stop talking so you can talk back to me.
Thanks, Sarah. That was really awesome. You can stop sharing, and the questions should be on the doc we shared with you.
All right. Opening them now. Oh, Mary from Scotch Plains. What a great question. So Mary from Scotch Plains asks, did starfish have the same number of legs as they do today? Some with 5, others with 9, etc. So starfish and all echinoderms have a type of symmetry that, I kid you not, scientists call five-ishness, right? Starfish are technically bilaterally symmetrical, meaning right down the middle, just like you and I are, but they have something on top of it, which is kind of a five-ishness. So they're not really pentaradial, but they're close. And I promise you, that's what we call it. So all throughout history, all echinoderms, except for the very, very first ones, have that five-ishness to them. If an echinoderm has 9 or 11 limbs, right, that means that there is a genetic mutation that has been passed along. So a teratology, essentially, which means that there's something just a little wonky with it. So that's a great question, Mary from Scotch Plains. All right, so let me see. Ria's mom would like us to know, can we use the chemical compositions of echinoderm fossils to reconstruct past climate conditions? That is an excellent question, and we absolutely can. So echinoderms are made out of calcium carbonate, just like the limestone here in Florida. And calcium carbonate is really sensitive to changes in acidity and changes in temperature. So, you know how sinkholes develop in Florida? You might hear that on the news sometimes. We actually have sinkholes develop. That's because the limestone here has kind of eroded away from the acid rain. So, echinoderms struggle to make their skeletons in times of incredibly high acidity in the water, which has happened in the past before. So, we can actually track the amount of CaCO3, that's calcium carbonate, what limestone and echinoderms are made of, to kind of see what the acidity was like throughout climate or throughout the history of climate change. It's a great question. Kendall Baker asks, how many years of schooling is required to become a paleontologist? That's another great question. So I went for the long haul. I went to college for 10 full years. So I went for 4 years to get my undergraduate degree at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So I'm a giant basketball fan. I got my master's at Auburn University in Alabama, which was 2 years. And then I got my PhD, which was 4 years again, at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. So you don't have to have a PhD to be a paleontologist. And in fact, there's many folks who are paleontologists that may not have gone to school at all. There are things like avocational paleontologists, so folks who just love fossils so much they can't contain their love for them, so they go out every weekend and find fossils. So I actually work with them a lot of the times. But to be a professor, you need a PhD. To work in a museum, that can depend on the type of job. So some outreach coordinators can get a bachelor's degree or a master's degree. It really depends on the type of job you want to do. But to be a paleontologist, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to go to school for a really long time. It doesn't mean you have to make those types of decisions. A paleontologist can also be an accountant who really just loves fossils so much that they go out every weekend and work with other scientists, which there are a lot of them out there, which is really fun. It's a great question. All right, so I'm going to kind of cycle back through some of these questions here. Did echinoderms have a period of gigantism like other animals like dinosaurs and giant land mammals did? Mary from Scotch Plains asks this question, which is such a great question. So dinosaurs got really, really, really big. Mammals got really, really, really big, right? We've all seen the long neck dinosaurs, and maybe you have seen the woolly mammoth and things like that. So gigantic animals. Echinoderms didn't do that so much. And the reason why is they never had enough oxygen to really help them get that large. So echinoderms, especially the ones I'm working with, they are breathing in different ways. They're actually exchanging gas through pores in their skeleton. And that can be really difficult because if you want more oxygen exchange, you have to make your skeleton weaker. As you can imagine, that might not be a great idea to make your skeleton weaker. That might make you that much more delicious to a predator, right? So echinoderms had to balance that. So if they got too big, they would have a harder time breathing, essentially getting enough oxygen. And if they try to increase their oxygen, they might sacrifice their body strength, which is not a good idea either. So that's a really great question. So another question, where do you find the most echinoderm fossils? Which country or environment? Excellent question. So one thing, echinoderms all live in the ocean. And that's for the same for 500 million years ago to now. All echinoderms live in the ocean. They have to. They don't have a way to filter out salt from their blood like we do. That's why we have kidneys. Echinoderms don't have anything like that, so they can't live in fresh water at all. So anywhere where there was an ancient ocean, there might be echinoderms. So that's one of the things we look for. Limestone and other things like that usually tell us there was an ancient ocean there. That's the majority of our limestone. But places that have really common fossils are in the middle of the United States. So places like Ohio and Kentucky and Indiana have tons and tons and tons of beautiful echinoderm fossils. New York has lots of beautiful ones, especially up closer to the north part of New York, near Canada and Niagara Falls. New Jersey doesn't have too many, though there are a few. So, and globally, Europe has quite a few of them, as does China. So there's a lot of really cool places across the world that have them. Another question is, how many different echinoderms exist today? There are thousands of echinoderms today. I don't know the specific number of species, But one question that kind of leads into that is, how did echinoderms survive big questions when others didn't? So that's a really good question. Most echinoderms didn't survive. So we looked at that beautiful phylogenetic tree, the evolutionary tree. We know that there's 5 living groups today, and there were about 24 others in the past living groups. So across the extinction boundary of the biggest mass extinction of all times, which was called the Permo-Triassic extinction event, otherwise known as the Great Dying, which sounds a little dramatic, but it's true. 96% just about of all life on Earth died. And that really meant almost all echinoderms died as well. Very few species made it across. So we went from a diversity of 24 groups down to 5 across that boundary. So echinoderms barely squeaked through that extinction event. They have since proliferated again and become more diverse, but most of our diversity was lost about 250 million years ago during the Permo-Triassic extinction. That was an excellent question. I believe that was from Jim Ruddock. So are any echinoderms dangerous? Awesome question. So yes, some of them do have poisonous spines. So sea biscuits, some sea biscuits do actually have poisonous spines. Most of them are absolutely harmless unless you are a snail or another delicious piece of algae that might be food for a starfish. Most echinoderms today are actually predators. I don't know if you knew this, but a starfish is a predator. It has the ability to eject part of its stomach out through its mouth. I'm pretending my hand is a starfish, so its mouth is here, its butt is on the other side, and it can actually go and eat something. It's much slower in real life, but there you go. So some echinoderms are predators. In the past, they were mostly not predators. They were filter feeders. So they kind of just hung around, hoping water would bring them some delicious nutrients. All right. So another great question coming in, why did I decide to study echinoderms? And did I always know I wanted to be a geologist? I'm going to keep those two questions together because they're kind of tied together. So when I started college, I was going to be a high school music teacher. I wanted to teach band, marching band. I played the flute and the bagpipe, so I was a musician. And I really wanted to teach kids how to play music. And when I got to college, I started taking these classes in music, and I didn't like it. It was the weirdest thing. I loved music, but I hated learning about it constantly in like a professional setting. So I'm thinking, I don't want to do this the rest of my life. So I took a random class called Prehistoric Life, where a professor started telling me all about the beauty of fossils on Earth from a time before I even knew about. And I just fell in love with the material. And at the end of that first lecture, I said, you know what? I'm going to be that person in the front of the room someday. I'm going to be a geology professor. And I never changed my mind. So there you go. So if you ever go to college and I hope you take some random classes and I hope you find something that you love that much. Now, why did I study echinoderms? I looked at fossils and I studied fossils all throughout my undergraduate classes. And I really just found myself loving looking at echinoderms. I don't know that I could put it into words, but you know how there's just something you are just more drawn to? There was something so beautiful and mysterious about these weird fossils from hundreds of millions of years ago that I just had to keep learning more about, which is why I ended up studying echinoderms for the past 10 years. What is the most exciting place I have traveled to for research? It's a good question. Sardinia was really fun. So Sardinia, Italy, that was an exciting place. It was in the middle of nowhere. So Sardinia is an island, all right? And the big city, Cagliari, is down here. And we went over here to the coast where very few people live. And we went to a tiny, tiny little fishing village with one restaurant and one spot for internet in the entire area. And the post office was only open once a week. It was a teeny tiny little place called Bujeru. And it was just beautiful. It was so exciting to go because we were some of the first people to look for fossils there. Although people in the area loved fossils and they were so excited to talk to paleontologists and show them the fossils that they found. So we chatted with goat farmers a goat herder, and farmers who wore fossils around their necks as jewelry that they had just found while they were out feeding the goats one day. So it was so much fun to talk to people who loved these fossils so much, and then they could tell us a little bit about what they learned, and we could tell them a little bit about what we learned, and it was a really fun experience. So that's probably one of my favorite places that I've traveled to. All right, what other questions? How does starfish regrow their legs? Excellent question. So starfish have the ability to regenerate their limbs. All right. It is a specific gene that they have that we don't have, right? We cannot regrow our limbs. So starfish have a particular gene that is switched on in their embryonic stage when they're wee little babies, and they can actually regrow their limbs sometimes, which is really, really incredible. Great question. Another question from Ria's mom. Since you mentioned limestone, have you ever seen any sinkholes? Yes. So a lot of places that I look for fossils, like Kentucky, has sinkholes. So a lot of the times they're covered with grass, especially in Kentucky. So you'll just see a nice little dip like this. In Florida, there's sinkholes all over the place. So some are little itty bitty ones, some are quite large. One of the larger sinkholes is about an hour-ish away from here in Orlando, or right south of Orlando, and it's gigantic. And it formed really quickly over the period of a couple days, and it forced a bunch of houses to cave in. Great questions today. Catherine, age 10. She found several shark teeth in a creek and would like to know what kind of sharks they were. That is awesome and so exciting. I think that every single fossil find is a gift from the earth, and I really love that. So Catherine, you can send some photos to the Geology Museum and they can help you identify them. They can send you some resources to help you do that. Another question, what animals preyed on ancient echinoderms? That is another excellent question, Mary from Scotch Plains. So we do have a lot of evidence in the fossil record in the form of what we call trace fossils, not body fossils, that's the animal itself. Trace fossils are the things that were left behind from an action that was left behind by the living critter. So for example, footprints are trace fossils, or coprolite, fossilized poo is an example of a trace fossil. So in the fossil record with echinoderms, we can find parasites that bored into echinoderms, and we're able to get into the skeleton enough to get to the soft tissue. We find that there are some fish teeth scars left behind on echinoderms. So a lot of different organisms were preying on echinoderms. Echinoderms were also really, really good living structures for critters that lived on top of animals. So you know how there's organisms that grow over each other today? Like some sponges will grow over clams and things like that. Some corals will grow over clams. Echinoderms were also really good for that. So a lot of things grew over them, and that might have actually contributed to their death as well. That is a great question, Mary from Scotch Plains. So another question I just saw come in is, where in Kentucky do I go to find fossils? Oh my gosh, there's so many great places, but my favorite is right up at the Cincinnati, Ohio to Kentucky border. So there's lots and lots and lots of great fossils right up there. So my favorite, there's a Walmart really close to the Kentucky-Ohio border. This might be getting off topic, but there's a Walmart right there. I can't remember the city it's in, but it's the closest one to Cincinnati. If you go behind the Walmart, it's allowed. They're fine with it. And there's just fossils galore. So cool. All right. What other questions? These have been so many great questions here. Why is Eumorpha Cystis my favorite echinoderm? So Eumorpha Cystis was that first photo I showed you. All right. Why is it my favorite echinoderm? It's my favorite because it's a weirdo, and I just love it. So why it's so weird is we thought it belonged with one particular group of echinoderms, but then we found another specimen that showed it had the arms of a crinoid. So we were just like, it kind of looks like two different groups mashed together into one. And what we see is it's actually a transitional fossil between two major groups of echinoderms, kind of like how we find transitional fossils of the first dinosaur bird-like things like Archaeopteryx, where it has wings, but it has a long tail like a dinosaur, but it has a beak, right? or the first organisms to walk on land, the first vertebrates to walk on land, like Tiktaalik, the walking fish thing. So we find these transitional fossils that help us understand how evolution works in geologic time, which is really just fascinating. So that's why it's my favorite critter in the fossil record. All right, I'm looking for any other. When do echinoderms first appear in the fossil record, from Jim Ruddock? It's a great question, Jim. So there's some debate on whether or not they showed up before a time called the Cambrian and the Ediacaran. So some people think that we have the ancestral relationships of echinoderms in the Ediacaran, but we're not sure yet. So the first echinoderm that we're absolutely sure is an echinoderm shows up in a time called the Middle Cambrian. So just about 520-ish million years ago is the very first echinoderm that shows up. Excellent question. What did the echinoderm group evolve from? Excellent question, Jim, again. So echinoderms are actually closely related, and I know you might think I sound absolutely bananas when I say this, but echinoderms can actually be closely related, or not, excuse me, I'm gonna start this sentence over. Oh my gosh, ugh, words are not my strong suit today, apparently. So echinoderms are closely related to vertebrates. So hundreds of millions of years ago, we think about 600 million years ago, 700 maybe, that there was a split in two major groups. Echinoderms went one way, and chordates, things with backbones and things like that, that includes the vertebrates, so things like you and me, and dogs, and cats, and things like that, went the other way. So echinoderms actually have a lot of similarities with vertebrates today and other chordates. One of the things they have in common is what we call a Deuterostome gut. So essentially, that has to deal with when you are a wee baby embryo. On the first or second, third day of your life, you have the development of two different holes that will eventually become your stomach and your mouth and your bum, right? So echinoderms have the exact same formation of that as do vertebrates. And that separates them from other things like insects and clams that don't have that specific embryonic development. It's a great question. Is there such a thing as a pink starfish? You bet there is, and they are beautiful. Great question. I'm looking for any other questions that I haven't already touched on today. What animals eat echinoderms today? Lots of different things. Birds eat them today. Otters do. A lot of fish eat them today. So a lot of different types of predation. So birds will actually take rocks sometimes, and they will drop them on sea biscuits to break open their shell, which we call a test. They'll actually drop rocks. Or otters will break them sometimes, depending on what's going on. So there's a lot of really cool predation that happens in real time today that we might be able to say, oh, well, maybe some of this stuff happened in the fossil record. There are a lot of different traces in the rock record that we can see from boring snails and things like that. Boring as in able to drill a hole, they're not interesting. All fossils are very interesting, right? So we can actually see those types of things. How much time does it take to find a fossil? Great question. It can take a long time. So it can take you a really long time to be able to walk around and spot something else in a rock. So one of the things that we have to do is we have to find rocks of the right age. So if I want to look for echinoderm fossils, and if I want to look for specific echinoderm fossils, I need to identify rocks that are of the appropriate age. So if I want to find modern echinoderms from 40 million years ago or so, I shouldn't go to rocks that are 100 million years. We should find rocks that were of ancient marine. So we should find rocks that are limestones and things like that. So that can help us narrow down our search a lot. But even past then, a lot of the times it comes down to just luck. You can look and look and look for fossils, and sometimes you won't find what you're looking for. So you train yourself to be able to look at the rocks on the ground and look at things that might look just a tiny bit different. Does one of the little pieces of rock catch the sun a little bit differently? You might be looking at a fossil. So a lot of the times you might have to break open rocks with hammers to find anything hiding inside those rocks. But sometimes you get lucky. Sometimes you have to go back a couple times before you find anything. So, for example, one of my colleagues looks in Argentina for echinoderms. He's been 3 times and he has not found a single echinoderm, even though the rocks are of the right age and they're of the right type, and all the other types of fossils that we would expect to live with echinoderms, like trilobites and brachiopods, other common fossil groups, are there. So we think that they're there. We just haven't gotten lucky enough to find them yet. Great questions.
Looks like there's one more question for you from Jim Ruddock. Is the fossil record for echinoderms relatively complete, or are there some obvious gaps in our knowledge?
Awesome. So, Jim, the fossil record for echinoderms is mostly okay. I'll say that. It's mostly okay. So, like that starfish I showed at the very beginning of our talk today, that has over 1 million pieces, as you can imagine, one of the best ways to get echinoderm fossils is if we bury them alive. So if there's like a storm event and we have a lot of mud and sand coming in and just falls down on top of a bunch of living things, they get buried alive. That's the best way to find echinoderm fossils from hundreds of millions of years ago. Because their bodies are so delicate, they break apart really quickly. And we know that because we can do experiments on echinoderms today to see how long it takes for their bodies to fall apart. That being said, because the pieces of echinoderms are made out of a fossil-forming material, calcite, that's pretty durable. We can generally trace echinoderm evolution through just those little pieces. So if I find little pieces of stems or little pieces of arms, we know that they're still there even if we can't learn much more about them. So even though they're not perfect, and there are some gaps where we don't exactly know what's happening, and there's times on Earth where we have very few fossils, like in the early Silurian, which is a time just under 400 million years ago or so, where ocean levels were really low because there was a major glaciation, so lots of glaciers. So most of our water was in the ice, so sea levels were really low. We don't have nearly as many fossils from that time because we have less ocean water, we have less opportunity to preserve those rocks. So sometimes our gaps are a little bit bigger than others, but for the most part, we're doing okay.
And it looks like we have one more question, which is, can you find fossils everywhere, or is there a place you need to find it?
That's an excellent question. So fossils can be found more often than people think. You do need to be near sedimentary rocks, so rocks that are made from sand and sedimentary pieces. Typically those that preserve near water, that were near water. So ocean rocks are really good places, or maybe ancient riverbeds and things like that, where we would find those most commonly. Igneous and metamorphic rocks, which are formed by volcanic events or from heating and melting events, typically won't preserve any fossils. Sometimes metamorphic rocks, we can have some fossils that have been kind of messed up, kind of still inside that rock, but it's not very common. So if you're near sedimentary rocks, you might be able to find fossils. But one thing you can do is you can check out Google. You can look at different things like the paleobiology database online and see what fossils have been found near you, because there's giant maps with hundreds of thousands of fossil entries, and you can actually take a look to see if any fossils have been found near you. And that's a really great way to start looking.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah. That was really awesome. I learned a lot myself, and I'm sure all of our viewers did too. So thank you once again. And to all of our listeners today, thanks for tuning in. This event was live streamed on Facebook, so please feel free to check out our page. Give us a follow on Instagram and Twitter. And next.
Hey, Reed, one more question just popped in.
Oh, sure.
Is there a certain level of ground that's more likely to have fossils in it when digging on flat land, or is it more of a lucky guess when it comes to uncovering completely buried fossils?
That's a great question. Typically, there's not going to be one area that's better than another. So we do know that there are fossils that are underneath our feet that might be too far for us to easily get to. But when it comes to fossils that are still on the surface or within like 5 feet of the surface, it's really going to be kind of lucky. We're not going to be really sure. There's sometimes where we can pinpoint where fossils might be being weathered out of the sediment. Like if we're driving on a highway and you see rocks on the side of the highway, that's not a sight that I ever see anymore in Tampa. I never thought I'd miss it. So for those of you listening in New Jersey, appreciate it. I haven't seen a real rock in forever. Tampa's just sand. But you can actually sometimes see the fossils coming out and you can trace it back to where it might have been coming out from. But a lot of the times it's going to be a lucky guess from there. Great question.
Great. So thank you once again, Sarah, and thank you for everyone who's listening. And don't forget to tune in to our next series, which will be on October 23rd, which is a Friday. At 1 p.m., we will have Nicole Conklin, who is a PhD student at Antioch University, New England. She's also an animal keeper at the Liberty Science Center, and she will be speaking to us about misunderstood sharks. So once again, that will be on Friday, October 23rd. So, Sarah, and have an awesome day.
Thank you so much for having me.